Hello, I'm going to be showing you a bit about debugging in React. Um, so um, this assumes you have some familiarity with debugging and a basic familiarity with React. And just want to give some ideas about how you can bring those together. Previously, if you've been working with JavaScript code, but not React, you may have been having just a few JavaScript files running in your website, but now you'll have a library React running, and that's being put together by Webpack, which is running as part of your Create React app most of the time, unless you set it up your Webpack up yourself. And what that means is there's lots of third-party code, or what's called can be called vendor code, which is code you didn't write and aren't really responsible for. So when you're debugging, most of the time, you don't really want to be looking in that code. And so you'll want to know how to deal with that correctly. So I would say that's one of the big differences. The other aspect will be that you have source maps that you're using for your debugging. You don't really have to worry about that with Create React app because Dan Abramov is basically taking care of that for you. And Webpack is very good about taking care of that for you as well. So the Webpack, the source maps should already be taken care of, but I'll talk about that a little bit too. So I have a very simple application here. It's just a to-do list, very minimal. And I already have yarn start from Create React app running, so it's already in development mode. So I'll go ahead and show you that. So I just create stuff to do, and I can toggle it basically. So it's a pretty basic app. Now, so I have already installed the React developer tools. Let's take a quick look at that. I think you're maybe familiar with them already, but just want to show them. I do have some errors in here related to some of my other extensions. That's normal, but just because you're seeing an error related to your extensions doesn't mean you shouldn't check to see if there are errors coming from your app. Sometimes you'll just ignore all these errors if you have some that are being caused by an extension, and that can cause you to miss important errors. So here, anyway, is my React debugger that I've installed in Chrome. And basically what this is great for is letting me see the tree structure of my React app, and I can see what my props are on any of my components, and then I can examine state. Let's see where my state is. Yeah, I can examine my state as well, which is pretty nice. So that is something that will be very useful for you when you're debugging your application in real time and trying to see what the actual state of your app is. But there's also the sort of step debugging that you'll want to do, where you are getting an error of some sort and you want to figure out what the source of that specific JavaScript error is. So let's go ahead and generate one in our code. So I'm going to say, so we have our to-do component right here, and that is being processed or created by a to-do list that's mapping over its props and creating it. Now we have a to-do prop right here, and we're passing an item from the array. Let's say I have a typo and I capitalize this. Okay. So it's recompiling, and let's see what happens in my code now. Okay. I'm gonna close out of my React. Okay. Cannot read property completed of undefined. So now what's happening is my code is crashing before the app even gets up and running, which basically means my React debugger isn't going to help me because it's a JavaScript error. So whenever you get an error, you want to go and look at where it's actually happening in the code. You want to read the error message. Sometimes React will tell you specifically what the problem is. In this case, it kind of is. It's telling us cannot read property completed of undefined, and it's showing us what line that's on. So what I would do normally is go and look at that line and start debugging there. So it's on in my to-do component on line 6. So it's in my code, in VS Code, and you can debug directly in VS Code, and I prefer to do it that way. But not everybody uses VS Code, and it takes a little bit of setup. So I'm just going to debug straight in Chrome here. So in order to do that, I'm going to do open up my debugger, or my Chrome inspector. I'll do that with Control-Shift-I. And that brings it up. And then I'm going to want to go into my Sources tab here. And I just have some stuff open already, so don't worry about that. So what I'm going to show you, so I could just look at my code right away. The way you do that, it shows you, you can just open File. So I can go ahead and do Control-P. And I know what I'm looking for is in my to-do.js. It's showing me right here. And the reason it knows about this is because of source maps, because actually my code is being combined together by Webpack in the backend. So this isn't what the actual code that's running looks like. But because of source maps, Chrome knows about where the actual original source of the JavaScript that's running is, and it's mapped onto it, so I can use it. So I want my to-do. So again, I did Control-P. I'm going to type to-do.js. And that brings up, and I actually, looks like I had a breakpoint here from earlier when I was getting ready. So basically what so here, I'm going to make a little more room for this. And I'll make it a little bigger. Okay. So here's my code. You'll notice that some of it's grayed out. Basically, the grayed out stuff is not, so what's happening here is this is a single function, and all the function does is it returns what's in here, and what's in here is just an expression. So this is just like one big object as far as JavaScript's concerned. So really it's just like 1 or 2 lines of code. There's not like, so there's all that's happening is there's a return, an implicit return here, and then there's just this one thing getting returned. So if I'm going to debug it, there's really only one thing to debug. And the way I'm setting up a breakpoint is just by clicking to the left of the thing I want to debug. So let's go ahead and I'm going to refresh. And looks like it's hitting that breakpoint even before. Let's try and refresh once more and see if we can get it. Okay, there it goes. Okay, so it paused on my breakpoint. Okay, props isn't defined yet because it hasn't actually entered in when it runs. So I'm going to go ahead and click F5 and let's see. Okay. Let's go ahead and let it play. All right, it's still, let's see if I can get it to break inside of here. Okay, So the basic problem, I think, is because it's an implicit return, it's not giving me a chance to actually step into the code and debug it. So in order to fix that, I'm going to make it not an implicit return. So I'm going to just do this. And this isn't going to persist because I'm just doing it in my Chrome code right now, and that doesn't get saved locally. So let's see. Okay, just seeing what my error is here. So returning this, so that should be okay. Let's see what I did. Okay, it's fine. Oh, it was giving me that error before in the first place. Okay, let's see. Okay, so I'm going to try again. What is this error? Let's see. Trying to see why it's giving me an error right now. All right. Refreshing it. And sometimes you have to sort of live figure out what exactly the problem is, like I'm doing now. Okay, so I'm going to try that once more. So I'm going to go ahead and add this. Oh, I know. So the problem is I have a source map, so I can't, this isn't the actual code that's running, right? Because it's getting it's getting combined into another set of code called a bundle by Webpack. So if I want to be able to debug a little better, I'm going to need to go back to my VS Code. And let's go to my to-do. And I will go ahead and fix this. So I'm going to say return. And then I'm going to add that. And it doesn't like it just because it's messing up my indentation, but that's okay for now. So let's go back and see if it runs okay this time. Okay, so let's put it on line 4 right before it returns and refresh. Okay, and that time it worked. So there is some live real debugging for you. So trying to figure out how to get it to work. So now we're inside of the to-do functions application. And we know that the error we were getting before was that completed is undefined. So we can go and say, okay, well, we can mouse over our props. There's actually a few ways to see this. I'm going to exit out of my console for now. So I can go, here's my call stack. So I can see my local scope. And anything in my local scope, I can see. I can just look here and see what the see what's in it, what the value is of any of any variables that are defined. So, but that's one way to do it. But a lot of times, I like to just hover over my code and see what's in it. So here I'm like, okay, here's my props. And here's my to-do. Uh-oh, my to-do's undefined. Obviously, it shouldn't be. If I'm trying to reference it, especially if I'm trying to reference a property off of it, that means I'm not expecting it to be undefined. So that's a problem. So then I would need to think, okay, why is this undefined? Where I'm like, well, is it on it's props is being passed to it. And if I know my React, I know that props get passed by the parent component. So I would want to go figure out where that is. So I'm going to let this finish running. And actually, let's see if my parent component's in the call stack. It is, but it maybe, actually, maybe not. It's pretty high up if it is. So let's ignore that. Let's go ahead and let it finish running. And then it should crash. Yeah. All right. So now I'm going to go look at my VS Code real quick and just remind myself, okay, my to-do is being created in my to-do list. So to-do list is the thing that's calling my to-do right here. So if I want to figure out what the problem is, I need to figure out what's going on inside of that one. So I can go back to my sources in my inspector and do Control P, do to-do list. I can open that up. And I can go ahead and I'll put a debugger. So I'm going to have the same issue maybe with it as I did last time, where this is an implicit return, so it's not going to want to let me stop before it returns. But because there's a function that's mapping on the inside of it, I can probably put a breakpoint there, and that'll get it to stop it. Let's go see if I'm right about that. I'm refreshing. Okay, and that worked. So now we're getting ready to create our to-do component, right? So we can go and say, all right, so I'm passing a key prop. Here's my item. Here's my ID. That's all fine. And then here's my to-do, and here's my item. I'm passing that. And so this is one of those things where even debugging probably won't help you, because what you need to notice at this point is that to-do, but is not spelled the same, right? So what you would need to do is just look really close and be like, okay, I'm passing a to-do. And then go double check, go look at your to-do and say, okay, here's my to-do, and it was undefined, I remember. So you would eventually see that the to-do it's a different property altogether because it's spelled differently. So you would want to fix that basically. And then so you would have to fix it in your code. So let's go and fix it. And the reason you have to fix it in your code is because all this is getting compiled by Create React App. And so you can't make live changes to in the debugger in order to get it to be recognized. So let's let it finish running, and then I'm going to go ahead and it's actually, yeah, I'm going to refresh, and now it's working again. So that might have been a bit annoying, having to go back and forth to get our code to update. So what we can do is tell Chrome about where our files are, and then Chrome will allow us to actually update them as we go. So the way you would do that is first I'm going to go back to VS Code, and I'm going to open up the actual location of my folder. There's a few ways you can do it. You could do in Windows Control-KR, and that would open it up, or I could just go like right click on it, and I could go Reveal and Explore, and that brings up my my project folder basically. And then I'm going to go into Chrome. I'm going to go back to Inspect, and it brings up my sources. Now what I'm going to do is your sources has different pages. There's overrides, content strips, and snippets, and file system. If it's not on file system already, you'll want to go there. And then what you can do is I need to basically drag my to-do folder into my workspace. So to do that, I'm just going to go up a layer, and I'm going to drag it over to drop workspace folder here. And then before it does anything, it's going to say DevTools requests full access to whatever folder I just dropped. It's asking that because it's going to be allowed to modify folders directly on my hard drive, and it wants to make sure I really want to do that, which I do, so I can allow it. Okay. And now I have these little green circles on my files, which means they're hooked up now to my local disk. So let's try something else. So let's say let's say I named this one to all my examples aren't very good illustrations because it's hard to create really good debugging examples for me because the real bugs always just emerge on the fly for me. But this will create an error. And we're actually already hitting that breakpoint because I didn't remove it earlier. So let's make this full screen. And so we can go back and see where my breakpoint is. Oh, and it's right here. So I'm already looking at it. So now what I could do, and so it has that incorrect to do item. What I could do is fix it right here in my code. And then I can, now what I can do is I can save it. And I can let it run. And now it should be reloading. Oh. Let's, right, I saved it. Now I'm refreshing. And I'm gonna get rid of this breakpoint. Okay, and now it's working. So notice I was able to fix the problem without actually having to go back and toggle between my VS Code. It was a little bit, I had to refresh, right? And basically what I'm doing is I'm making a change back here in my VS Code, and I'm pushing that change from Chrome into my code here. And then because I have this yarn start from create React app running, it needs to recompile each time. So it takes a second for that to recompile, and then I needed to, it should cause it to refresh on its own, but you might need to do F5 to make it refresh. The normal stuff will apply when you're debugging, so you can step over, so stepping over in your code, let's find something that has a few lines in it. So let's go here. It doesn't want me going inside the constructor for some reason. Let's go ahead and let's see. Let's go ahead and refresh and see what lines it'll let me go to. Actually, let's close. I don't want to close it all the way. Just wanted to close the instance I had open of the local host. So let's wait for it a sec. Okay. So I'm going to do Control-Shift-I and open it up. And let's see if it'll let me. Okay, so now that it's not open, when it's open, it's like trying to interpret my code live. So it's trying to basically tell me where I can put a breakpoint or I can't based on my current position in the code of whether that breakpoint will be reachable. But here it's not open, so it doesn't even know about that. So maybe that'll let me just put these here and I can step through a little, just so I can remind you how that works. Okay. And it didn't actually break inside of there, which is interesting. I wonder if I put the breakpoint here, if it'll let me step into it. Might be a good example, actually, of some of the stuff I'm talking about. Let's see. A refresh. Okay. So it's breaking on the outside, but this is just the definition of the class because we're outside of it. So that's not going to help us at all. So I'm going to resume my script execution. Okay. So now it's on React render and then app. And Let's just double check that it's not going to let me in here. And so this might be a mapping thing. It might be that because probably what's happening is because we're transpiling our code into ES5 using Babel, which is something you do in React. We're not using the class. We're not actually using the class syntax. It's getting transpiled into an earlier form of a declaration, so it doesn't map onto it exactly. I would still expect to be able to do this dot state, but it doesn't look like it'll let us do that. So that might, let's see, maybe toggle complete would be a good way to show stepping through. So let's do that instead. I'm gonna get rid of these breakpoints. Okay. And I'm gonna refresh. Okay. All right, so now I'm gonna toggle complete and yep, it hit the breakpoint. So now it's at the very first item. I can see what the target ID that was passed. I can see the console log. And let's see, I can see this dot set state. So basically there's let's do it. So this one is step over next function call. And what this will do is it'll go like line by line within this file. So if I click it once, it goes to this dot set state. If I click it again, it goes to the end, right? Because that was actually my last call. Now, let's go ahead and then if I stepped over again, it well, then it starts going into what comes next, and because there was mapping after the toggle, it took me to my to-do, which because basically it's updating all of my it's updating my state of all my to-dos, and then it needs to re-render each to-do so you can see that it's going into my to-do.js, and it'll do it a few times to update them, I believe. But let's go back to my app.js. Nope. Maybe I just have an index on this one. Okay, and let's go ahead and refresh it. And I'm going to toggle, and I'm back in it. Okay, so now there's this option, step into next function call. So let's step over, and then there's this set state method that's about to be called. So let's say if I did want to go into that and see what was actually happening, I could step into next function call. And well, it's actually, before it can actually call this set state, it is it's calculating what it should actually what it should be. So it's going to be running this little bit of function that I've put together, and let's step over a bit. Okay, we're returning. Okay, and now it's ready to go actually into this set state. So I think so. Let's step into it. Oh. Step in. I'm trying to get it to take me into into React. Basically, it seems not to want to do that though. Okay, just a second. Okay, so I figured it out. So I had already made it black box React, which I didn't want it to do yet because I wanted to show you how and why to do that. So let's go ahead and I'm going to refresh it again. Okay, and I'm going to toggle. All right, so we have this dot set state. And first, it's going, if I step into it, it's going to go inside, and it's going to start running this map function to figure out what it should be setting state to. So I don't really care about that right now. So I'm going to step out of current function. And now I'm back at this set state. And it's getting ready to actually take what the object that it calculated was. It's going to take, so it just calculated this object to set to-do list equal to, and now it's getting ready to actually make that call to this dot set state. So now if I step into next function call, it takes me into react.development.js. And if you look at my call stack, I now have a bunch of React call stack stuff. So now I'm like deep in the React library. And if I start stepping through it, I'm going to be like, especially if I'm stepping into next function calls, but even if I'm stepping over it, oh, actually it was pretty short there. But if I were, but so basically the idea is when you're debugging and when you're going through errors in your code, a lot of the time, basically, you don't care about the react.development.js. So you're going to want to do what's called blackboxing, which is basically saying, hey, I don't care about that. I just want it to run and then go back to my code. So I'll show you how to get that set up. Just a second. All right. So yeah, so one area where it's going to be really helpful to Blackbox, I would say, is there's a really handy feature in Chrome debugger where you can pause on exceptions. And so it's right here. It's like a little stop sign. And if you click it and then you do pause on caught exceptions, it's I would say it's always best to do pause on caught exceptions rather than exceptions, because sometimes there are errors getting thrown in in the library code like React or something like that, and it's based on like how it's supposed to run, and they catch the error, they process it, and it keeps running. So you don't necessarily want to get stuck trying to like figure out when errors are throwing inside of when caught errors are being thrown, because if they're caught, they're handled. So most of the time you would want to check this to just pause on, oh, wait, sorry, you want to uncheck it. So it's unchecked by default. So yeah, so you want to only pause on uncaught exceptions. And so what that'll do is it'll still freeze it when there's an exception, but you don't want to freeze it in the middle of the React code, because you're not going to be able to debug that anyway, because it's not part of your code base really. Instead, you want it to pause within your actual code. And the way you do that is with blackboxing. So let's go ahead and quit beating around the bush and actually show you how that works. So you basically go to your settings, and you go to blackboxing, and then you tell it to blackbox content scripts. Then you would say add pattern. And most of the time, what I use here is just node modules. Because if we go back to the VS Code and I look what's in my project, all my dependencies are in my node modules, including React. And for the most part, I'm relying on those to function properly. So I don't really, it doesn't make sense for me to be seeing that code live while I'm debugging, unless I can't find a problem anywhere else possibly. But so that's why I use node modules there. So I go ahead and add it. Okay, and now I can just close out, and I'm going to refresh to make sure that's been recognized. Okay, and let's go ahead and see if it'll take us in to this set state like it did before. So I'm just going to choose this one because it's a one-liner, but it's not an implicit return, so we can get in there. And so this is update input. So whenever I enter anything into this input, it should fire. So I'm going to click, and it fires, right? So we hit our breakpoint. And now I'm going to go ahead and go into step into this dot set state, and it didn't go anywhere. See, because I have 18 stack frames that are hidden or black boxed. If I look at that, it's a bunch of React. So if you remember, what happened earlier is when I clicked on that, it took me into this React code, and that's like not useful to me. So now it's not even bothering. Like, it's just saying, hey, I'm setting state. Like, so so it's just going to the next call. And so that's, I would say, a huge deal for your code in general, is having that black boxing set up. Now let's go see what happens now if we just let's let it finish running. Let's see what happens if we just let this run. So I'm going to go start right here on line 76. So this will be when it starts rendering. And let me just a sec. Okay, I just had to double check something. All right, so this is kind of cool. So remember how earlier I was having trouble being able to access the actual declaration portion of my class of my app component? That was because I was starting it here with my React DOM.render, and then I wanted to get inside of here, but there's a ton of React library code between me and that, so I wasn't able to get to it because I would have had to basically step through like 50, 60 or something lines of code. I don't, that's an estimate. I just know when I'm clicking through it, it seems like forever, and you don't really know necessarily when it's going to end. But now we black boxed the React code. So what I can do is I can go ahead and refresh. Okay, and now it's on a breakpoint. So now if I step over, it's just going to go ahead and finish up the file because this is the last line in it. But if I step into it, I'll be going into this function, this render function, but it's a React function, and I black boxed it. So what'll happen? Let's find out. So I step into it. All right, and you're like, oh, this is a bunch of nonsense code. You told me that we wouldn't go into React code. And so this will be sort of an exception. This isn't React code, this is Webpack code. And it's basically the way this works is I think it's actually inlined into your code, so it's hard to black box. And what it's doing is it's getting your module, it's getting your imports for you, basically, I believe. So whenever you're, let's go back, whenever you're like referencing some JSX, that's been, I think, handled by Webpack as a module for you. And so it needs to go and call its modules to make sure it has everything required, including React, since it's a call to React. So all these imports are being handled by this this Webpack. See, it's Webpack and then Bootstrap in the file name if you read that. So it's being handled by this Webpack code, and you don't need to worry about it. I'm just explaining what it's doing. But so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to step over next function call, and it needs to load all the modules, so it's going to do it a few times. So I'm going to step over, and step over, step over. Okay, so now it's done stepping over that. It's loaded all the modules. I think that's what it had to do to actually load the React DOM.render. So now I'm going to step into it again. Okay, and now it's actually stepped into my app, and I can step into, so this is a constructor, so that's a call, so I can step into it, and now I'm inside of my constructor call. So the super is getting called, but now I could go ahead and see what's going on with my, oops, I want to, oh, I stepped into my constructor. That's the problem there. Let's see if I can get it back. All right. I didn't want to step into my super. I wanted to just go straight to my this.state. So now we're declaring this.state, right? So we have my this. This is the app that's getting created, and I can go ahead and see what exactly is being assigned. I mean, in this case, it's pretty straightforward. There's no variables being calculated or functions running, but I'm actually inside of the function seeing what's happening in real time. So that's pretty cool, because if I were having some sort of crash, or if I was having my state initialize improperly, I would be able to actually get inside of it and see what's happening. And that's just by using blackboxing and then using these step options intelligently. And yeah, so that's sort of the basics. I guess one other thing I want to make sure you're aware of is in the console. Can I just view the console down here? I feel like there is a way to just have the console on the bottom, but I closed it, which is annoying. Let's see. Show me the console at the bottom of the screen. Show console drawer. Cool. Okay. So whenever you're in debugger, you can put in arbitrary expressions in JavaScript and see what they evaluate to. So I could do this, and it actually shows me what this currently is. I could do props, right? Like this is, oop, I do this. So I can do props and click that. I don't have any props defined. And that's not that cool, because you can do it by clicking, like you can just hover over to see that same information. But what is cool is if you had more elaborate, like let's do it in here. Let's do that a second. So I'm gonna go ahead and let this resume, and then I'm gonna start updating my input. Okay, so now I'm frozen inside of update input. And now I could be like, I wonder what this whole thing is going to evaluate to. So instead of having to like just look at each item in it, I could copy it and run it. And it tells me. It's going to be input and then J. So that's a pretty cool thing too. When you're trying to debug, you can just copy and paste whole expressions and see what exactly is getting called to this .set state. So that's a big tool I would use. Let's see. I think I'm going to sort of be wrapping up here. I think I've gone long enough and touched on some of the high points. One thing that might be of interest at times is you have event listeners, and you can go and you could go and try and find event listeners in your page. Let's see, just a second. Yeah, so you could basically go ahead and create. So these are event listener breakpoints. So if you wanted to have your program, I should let it finish running. So if you wanted your program to pause on an event, you could just like toggle the click. And if I click, is it still paused? No, maybe it's not working. Maybe I'd have to refresh. Let's see if we can get it to work. I don't use these very often, but I just wanted to show you that I think the most important one to know about is the, it's hit that breakpoint. I think the most important one to know about is this one, where you tell it to pause on exceptions, because those, all right, let's see if the click one works. No, it's not working. Okay. Might be because React is like sort of taking charge of our all of our click events and whatnot. Um, but like, okay, so, but you could use that more if you were not doing React and just doing a pure Chrome JavaScript type of deal. Um, so there's global listeners. Not that interesting. One thing that's interesting is you can have down breakpoints. So I'll show you how you would set those. So this again isn't that useful in React because of the synthetic events are controlling a lot of your how your DOM is interacting. But let's say you wanted to let's say we want to break on this one when there's an attribute modification. So like if our JavaScript was adding, if our JavaScript was like adding a class name to it or something and we wanted it to pause when it did that, this is how we would go about it. Or if we wanted to pause when it gets, let's say, see if we wanted it to pause when it gets removed, which we could probably maybe get it to do that. Then basically, so we're basically telling it, hey, pause when some specific thing is happening to our DOM. And it's because of the virtual DOM, it might not work so well in React. But let's go ahead and add one. Okay, and we had a breakpoint here still, so let's let that run. Oh, actually no, the breakpoint. So that's cool. So the so our node removed actually did fire, and and the reason it was firing, I guess, is because it's re-rendering. So it's in the actual DOM. When these things are getting updated, it's removing these nodes and then adding them again. So I think that can be a useful tool, especially with blackboxing. I don't think it works perfectly in when you're using React, but I thought it was something worth sharing. So that's sort of an overview of some of the steps you can take to debug well using Chrome and React. I'll post a few resources with the video. All of this that I've shown you, you can do with VS Code, but I'm going to leave that as possible subject for another video or just something you can look into. So yeah, get in touch with me if you have any questions on anything I showed here. Hopefully this helps you out somewhat. So yeah, bye.